Speak slowly so you could all get your seats. Welcome to the TD Future Cities Speaker Series here at Evergreen Brickworks. We're delighted to welcome our speakers, Tamika Butler and Eric Klinenberg. Together, and with you, they'll talk about turning spaces into places, making the most of our social infrastructure. My name is Orit Sarfati, and I have the distinct pleasure and privilege of coming to work here every day. Tonight we'll be talking about what makes a great place. And so within this context, I want to talk about this place, Evergreen Brickworks. Starting back in 1889, this site was a brick-making factory that crafted the foundation for the buildings we pass by every day across Toronto. Think Massey Hall and Hart House at U of T. And after that, it was a derelict factory that hosted underground raves in a flood zone. And now it's a place where community gathers. Brickworks is where you bump into old friends at the farmer's market and where giddy 8-year-olds race down ravine trails. It's where couples exchange vows as snapping turtles glide by. It's a place for solitary wanderings and for capturing the last moments of sunlight at the overlook above our heads. Brickworks is a great place for many reasons. One that I deeply value is serendipity. And by that I mean a sense of discovery and exploration that looks different depending on the day. You all know it when you see it. Serendipity is this sense of anticipation to be surprised and delighted, turning the corner of a pavilion to discover a serene quarry just out of sight, walking along a path and discovering a hidden children's garden. Serendipity is one of the gold stars of placemaking because it's the culmination of a lot of things going right, and it's counterintuitive. To have serendipity, planners of a great place have to do a fair bit of prep work. As stewards of this place, we ask ourselves, what would I, as a first-time visitor, need to be able to explore a place on my own? Well, I'd need dependable signage, so I won't get hopelessly lost. I need some clear pathways to get me there from here that also happens to be subtle and inviting. I need for things to actually be hidden from me so that I'm enticed to start the adventure. So that's landscape design, physical density, programming, public safety, inclusivity, accessibility, and facility management, all coordinated to furnish this feeling of whimsical folly. What happens when a space can enable someone to wander on their own? Serendipity leads to agency, to someone feeling like they can be themselves and that there's room for them. And that's when community begins. Brickworks is getting ready to celebrate 10 years of serendipity and of gathering community. We're ushering in our next decade with a refresh of our site, and we've launched a participatory planning process that seeks your input for how to make this place thrive. And you'll see the boards over there that asks you about what you love about this place and what you love about great places. The historic remnants of the Brickworks factory here in this building reminds us of Toronto's labor history. And of course, previous to that, previous to Toronto as a city, there was a thriving society whose values connected to the well-being of this land. As we strive to build sustainable cities, we honor the hardworking laborers who build the foundations of this city. And we pay tribute to our original builders, the Indigenous stewards of this land. Evergreen acknowledges that the Brickwork site is built on Indigenous territory, on the traditional homelands of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe confederacies. This territory is in relation to the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe confederacies, and allies to peaceably share and care for the many resources of the Great Lakes. Toronto continues to be home to Indigenous peoples from many different nations across Turtle Island, and each day we're grateful to have the opportunity to live on these territories and to work with the community as a whole. Last November, Evergreen was thrilled to reveal our new national hub for city building, the TD Future City Center, located right here in this former kiln building. This space is a dynamic year-round destination. And as we'll see tonight, the TD Future City Center aims to ignite conversation, accelerate ideas, and demonstrate innovations to shape our cities for everyone and for the better. As part of our partnership, we're hosting the TD Future City Speaker Series. And tonight is part of this series of free public talks that features international speakers that present leading issues in city building. And to talk more about TD's contribution to building cities, it's my pleasure to introduce Anna Iacobelli from the TD Bank Group. Anna is a Senior Vice President of TD Bank Group. She proudly sits on the boards of TD's Friends of the Environment Foundation, the Joseph Brown Hospital Foundation, and recently chaired the United Way campaign, which achieved its goal of $9.1 million. Anna is actively involved with TD's Women in Leadership initiatives. Please welcome to the stage Anna Iacobelli.
Great, thank you. That's a very kind introduction, Aura. Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening. I am very pleased to be with you here at the 4th edition of TD Future City Speaking Series at Evergreen Brickworks in this fantastic space, which is part of the TD Future City Center that we inaugurated last November, almost a year ago. On behalf of TD Bank Group, welcome. It's great to see so many curious minds gathered here tonight to listen to this talk on a very important subject on the role of social infrastructure in creating connections and relationships in growing cities around the world. At TD, we are only successful if the communities we serve are successful as well. And building sustainable, resilient, and inclusive cities is part of this success. The fact that we are a founding partner of the Future Cities Canada is further proof that TD understands the importance of building sustainable and resilient cities. It matters because cities are where more and more people gather and choose to live, work, and play. As we all know, in Canada, 86% of Canadians live in urban centers, and over 50% of the world's population live in urban areas, and that number will climb to 60% by 2030. That's why we are very proud to partner with Evergreen through TD Future's City Center to connect, collaborate, and catalyze ideas into action that will shape our cities for the better. TD and Evergreen, as you've heard this evening, have a long history of working together. We've been partnering through TD Friends of the Environment Foundation for almost 2 decades. And through the READY commitment, TD is targeting $1 billion in community investments by 2030, focusing on 4 key drivers: financial security, vibrant planet, connected communities, and better health. That's why we believe when we acted together, we will have the greatest impact in supporting people's confidence in a more inclusive and sustainable tomorrow. These 4 drivers are the heart of the current issues facing our growing cities. So indeed, research shows that increasing urbanization will exacerbate affordable housing and access to green space for many individuals, impacting health and well-being, with 1 in 3 people feeling isolated and disconnected from their communities. So underpinning our many questions around affordability, inequality, poverty, climate change, and many more comes the theme of social inclusion and diversity. So I am super excited that tonight's event will attempt to connect many of these topics together through the role of social infrastructure in building more inclusive and sustainable cities. I am thrilled that TD, who has a long history of supporting diversity and inclusion, is working with Evergreen to allow tonight's critical conversation to take place. So I look forward to hearing from our speaker. So without further ado, I leave it to Michelle German from Evergreen to introduce our first guest, Eric Klinenberg. Thank you.
Hi everyone, how's it going? I have the supreme pleasure of doing two things, a little bit of housekeeping and then introducing our speakers, and later tonight moderating our conversation. For the Q&A, it's really important for us at any event that we have some way to interact and to understand what you're thinking and feeling. As you came in, you would have been given a little card. If you don't have one, your hand up and we have volunteers who are around to give them to you. As you're listening to the conversation, if you have a question if you have a question only, something that ends in a question mark and needs an answer, put it up in the air, the volunteer will come and get it for you, and then I will sift through them and ask our wonderful speakers to answer them. A couple of other things going on is we are live streaming. So for all of you folks at home, you can see this on YouTube. If you have friends who said they were going to meet you here and then they weren't able to come because they weren't feeling well, don't worry. You can tweet about it and let them know it's on a live stream. We're at Future Cities Canada. And if you love public dialogue, which I'm just going to go on a wild guess that you do because you trekked down here on this beautiful night, I would ask you to consider joining us for a 2-day version of tonight's talk on November 7th and 8th. We're hosting our second annual Future Cities Canada Summit. We're featuring many important and interesting speakers and thinkers from across the globe. Two that are particularly inspiring to me are Gabriela Gomez-Mont. She's the founder of Laboratorio para la Ciudad, which is the award-winning experimental laboratory as part of the Mexican government, and Bruce Katz, co-founder of the New Localism Advisors, a firm dedicated to working with cities to design better cities for everybody that are inclusive. So you can check out more online and consider tonight a little teaser. If you walk away feeling like, I just need more, then you should come to our summit. For those of you who need a break, our washroom is just over here. It's this big, beautiful white globe here. Feel free to take a break whenever you need to if your legs need a stretch. And a special thank you to our good friends at Mill Street Brewery and the Brickworks Cider House. They have provided the beverages for us, and we have a really interesting partnership where they get to name their beer after us and then we get to drink it. So it works for everybody. And finally, stick around after the event. One of the reasons we invited Eric Klinenberg here is because he just wrote this great book. So we'll have it on sale. He'll be signing it, and you can chat with him. At the end of the talk, we'll just shepherd him to the back of the room, and you can hang out with him there. So on that note, I would love to welcome Eric Klinenberg. He is an American sociologist and scholar of urban studies, culture, and media, and a professor and the director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. He's the author of Palaces for the People, How Social Infrastructure Can Help Fight Inequality, Polarization, and the Decline of Civic Life, which we have available, as I mentioned, for purchase here after the event. He is a celebrated author. This is not his first rodeo on writing a book. He wrote Heat Wave, a social autopsy of the disaster in Chicago, which won several prizes, and it seems that people were so moved by his writing that they turned it into a theatrical performance, which debuted in Chicago in 2008. He's also written Fighting for Air, The Battle of Control on America's Media, Going Solo, The Extraordinary Rise and Surprising Appeal of Living Alone. I really should read that one, though. And we should not forget that Eric co-authored Modern Romance, an investigation written with comedian Aziz Ansari, one of my faves. In addition to writing, he has also played a very catalytic role in changing the world around him. He joined the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's Rebuild by Design competition, which they launched in response to Hurricane Sandy. So not just writing about things and talking about how to change the world, but actually taking an active role in doing it. We're so lucky to have such an influential thinker and doer with us tonight. Welcome, Eric.
Hi there, thank you. It's so nice to be here. I'm really thrilled to be in Toronto because this is actually a kind of a celebration for me. It's not just that the book is out, it's that this is the official launch event for the paperback of the book, which literally just came out yesterday. And they said, Eric, where would you like to do your launch event? And I said, well, I grew up in downtown Chicago, and I've lived in New York City for almost 20 years now, and it's always been my dream to speak in a city where they really know how to play basketball. And so I wound up here, and I can live in the dream. So it's great to be here. I want to talk to you a little bit about this project and where it came from. And the book, Palaces for the People, is about this concept that I call social infrastructure. And I know that's a weird and wonky and new term for a lot of you. And so I just want to tell you as we get started, when I say social infrastructure, what I'm referring to are the physical places and the organizations that shape the way that we interact with each other. And I've come to see social infrastructure as being just as real as the infrastructure that we have for water or for power or for communication. It's something that is vital to our social life, and when we invest in it, if we take good care of it, if we maintain it, if we program it well, there are all kinds of benefits that we get. But unfortunately, if we neglect it and we stop building it well and we let it fall apart, we become all the more likely to kind of hunker down and spend time on our own. And it's the argument of my book that over the last several decades, we haven't just failed to invest in the hard infrastructure that tends to dominate our conversation about city making. We've also really neglected social infrastructure, and we pay a price for it. And in a way, my work on this book began when I started doing this project on Sandy that you just heard about. You probably remember Superstorm Sandy, and it was a hurricane before it got to New York City. It produced this image. I'm guessing this image is familiar to you. Has anyone seen this image before of Manhattan after the storm hit? It's kind of a remarkable thing because no one really believed that you could have a power outage in the center of the world for finance and for business and for capital that would last 5 or 6 days, but that's what Manhattan looked like for a long time. And there's this funny thing in the United States. These are just scenes from, this is the Lower East Side. There's an idea that when the federal government comes in to try to help a municipality or a state recover after a disaster, they refuse to give money for projects that make a place better than it was before. The rule is, because the federal government's a little bit skeptical of local governments, that you can build back just what was there before, but you can't make it better. And that's a strange idea because we live in a time now where, scenes like power outages in major cities and catastrophic flooding in neighborhoods that seem like they would stay dry are becoming more and more common. And so when Sandy happened, there was this guy running the United States named Barack Obama. Any of you guys remember President Obama? Is that name? Remember that? I like to think of that as the age of reason. And he came up with this idea that he was going to start a competition called the Rebuild by Design competition, which was meant to generate proposals from design teams, engineers, architects, landscape architects, city planners from around the world to think about what the future of the region could look like and to design new infrastructure projects. There's a couple $2 billion at the end of that rainbow. And so they asked me to be the research director for that competition. It was ultimately hosted at the Institute at NYU that I direct. And it was really important to have this Rebuild by Design competition in the United States and in New York because right after Sandy happened, there was this expression that everybody was using, including climate scientists and city planners, policy leaders in New York, the most enlightened people around. And what they were saying that New York City really needed to survive a future in which there were going to be rising seas and bigger storms, the thing that they said New York City needed, and tell me if this phrase sounds familiar to you, they said that what New York City needed to do was build oh my God, Toronto. Now, I had a bet before I got here about whether I could get a room full of Canadians to chant "Build a Wall." And nobody thought I could pull it off. I kind of thought maybe I had you for a second, but no. No, I mean, it's one of those expressions that you can't even get it out of your system, right? I mean, it just makes you feel like a horrible person when you say it. But that's it. So like the image you're looking at right now, that's not a real image, but that's one of the big design ideas that was all over the news after Sandy hit. There's a bridge there at the bottom called the Verrazano Bridge, and then people were suggesting we build seawalls all around New York City to keep New York City safe. And unfortunately, seawalls are really expensive, and they're really ugly, and they disrupt the entire ecosystem that comes after it if you have to keep the seawall closed a lot of the time. And so that turned out to be a really bad idea. But we had to come up with different projects. Like if you're not going to build giant walls to save you from a world that's changing, and I want to be clear, I think a wall is a really losing strategy, right? Because a wall says something. It's not just that it keeps you safe if you're on one side, it leaves everybody on the other side vulnerable, right? And it's just about the most antisocial infrastructure that you can imagine. So I don't want to live in a world where we solve our problems by building walls, partly because I think walls work about as well for water as they do for people. It's not a great strategy. So the competition was to generate new ideas. And there was it was a high-pressure situation. There were 148 teams of the world's best architects and landscape architects. I mean, household names that you know about, Rem Koolhaas and Bjarke Ingels, big firms that were trying to get in on this because it's a high prestige and a lot of money. And 148 teams applied. We had 10 finalists, and they had to come up with a design idea that would be big and inspiring enough to generate excitement and potentially a lot of money. We're talking about rebuilding the landscape around one of the most high-profile regions in the world. And there's one day I'll never forget where I was walking in Brooklyn with a team that had done extraordinary design work around the Gulf Coast of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. I mean, these guys had won a lot of awards. They were very creative. And they said, Eric, we've really been struggling to come up with a design that's worthy of this competition. And we've been thinking a lot about your idea for social infrastructure, right? Like, how do you build an infrastructure system that's going to protect you from rising water, but also will make life better every day? Because one of the big themes of my book is that we're going to be spending a lot of money on infrastructure, inevitably. And if we just build for a kind of 1 in 100 or 1 in 50 year problem, we're going to wind up in a really ugly world. But if we build infrastructure systems with both a security concern in mind, but also with the question of how do we build an infrastructure that makes life better in this place every day, then we get something really special. And they said, we've been thinking about how to do this, and we've come up with this idea. We have a prototype for a whole new building that we're inventing, a whole new structure, and we're calling it a resilience center. Any of you here work in climate space and urban issues? Anyone here really been tuned into this debate about climate? Have you heard that word resilience a lot? That word is everywhere, right? It's a big buzzword of our time. And I said, okay, I'm interested, but tell me what you mean by resilience center. And they said, okay, Eric, imagine if you had a building. We're going to prototype it in this one neighborhood, they said, but we really think this is a scalable thing. A building that was a public building. It was open, 5, 6, or 7 days a week. And it was meant to be a kind of home away from home. A place where everyone in the neighborhood knew they could go and always be welcome. So the doors are open most of the time. It's very accessible. It's staffed by professionals whose job is to be aggressively welcoming, which is kind of how I think of Canadians, aggressively welcoming, it's please come, And we'll program the building so people find it very appealing. The Resilience Center has to be for everyone, but the people who are most vulnerable, who are going to need the Resilience Center the most, are very young people and also very old people, because they're more bound to the neighborhood, right? And they said, we know that young people don't just come to the Resilience Center on their own. Young people have grown-ups, and so you need to figure out a way to bring them both. So for young people, maybe we would do story time in the morning at the Resilience Center. We could do sing-alongs. Maybe we do some arts and crafts classes and things like that, just nice community programs. And they said because they're going to come with these grown-ups, maybe we'll have some comfortable seating for them. We could have Wi-Fi access, some machines around. We really want to make it a place where they can get to know each other too. And they said for older people, a similar set of programs would really work in a resilience center. Like we could have a book group, we could have a current events class, maybe we'll do some kind of film series, maybe we'll have some special programs where the older people and the younger people will get together. And they said, look, Eric, we're so excited about this resilience center idea. Honestly, we think that within a small number of years, we're going to have demand from cities everywhere. And honestly, that the resilience center could go anywhere in the city, anywhere in the world. What do you think? And I've been teaching in universities for a long time, so I'm used to people pitching me projects, and I know that no matter what anyone has just presented me with, that the best thing I can say at first is always like, well, that's a really interesting idea, It's really exciting. And I did that. I said, I think that's a really interesting idea. And then I paused for a minute and I said, have you ever heard of a library? Because it seemed to me like what these guys had done in coming up with this great design idea for the Resilience Center is they had just reinvented the wheel, right? They had come up with an idea about what a resilience center could look like by basically mimicking an institution and a place that's really special, that's a vital part of the social infrastructure of most cities that I know and most neighborhoods that I know well in the United States, but that, to be honest, we have come to neglect, that we've come to forget in some cases. We've certainly deprived in far too many places. We think of it as maybe a luxury, take it for granted. And I thought, something is wrong if when we think about how to create a good place, we can only think of the latest technological thing or how to repurpose something old in a dramatic way, and we don't think about how to make something that works pretty well now even better. So I started spending time in this neighborhood in New York City called Seward Park, which is on the Lower East Side, and many of you probably know Lower East Side. It's a famous immigrant enclave in New York, and it remains that way. It's an incredibly diverse place where a lot of newcomers to the United States show up and build community. But it's also this place where there's a strange thing happening, and you might be familiar with it in Toronto. It's called gentrification. You know about gentrification here? That's something you talk about every once in a while. So like if you're the kind of person who wakes up in the morning and you say to yourself, where can I find a $12 ice cream cone in a place where the only flavor is salt, If you're that kind of person, like Seward Park in the Lower East Side is an amazing place for you to go because they have all kinds of salt ice cream shops. Some of them don't take cash. And it's really clear when you walk around the Lower East Side that there's this division between people who've been there for a while and who thought of the place as their home and people who are showing up and making it their own. And it's strange because there's also this commercial infrastructure that's got fast food, Dunkin' Donuts, McDonald's, and although it's a little bit more inclusive than the $9 or $12 ice cream cone place, if you look closely at what you find in fast food establishments, and I'm sure this is true in Toronto as well, you see these signs everywhere. Have you noticed signs like the one here that says, no loitering? Which of course means no loitering if you're a certain kind of person, right? Like I could go into this McDonald's with my laptop and I could sit there for 12 hours, and I don't think anyone would say anything to me. But if you're a person of color, if you're very poor, if you're sick, they're going to kick you out. In fact, that happened not just to people in this neighborhood, but surely you read about this case in Philadelphia a few years ago where 2 African American guys went in and waited for a friend who turned out to be 10 minutes late and got arrested. And in McDonald's in Queens not long ago, a group of elderly Korean Americans who had been going there for years to eat breakfast and pay for breakfast, they were kicked out because the manager thought they were there for too long. So that kind of famous third space that's a commercial place doesn't work for everybody. But when I walked into the library in Seward Park, this completely different world emerged, and it's one that I think is a little bit hidden from too many people, including the most affluent people who run our biggest businesses, people who run our philanthropies, and in too many cities, people who run the government as well. And there's this extraordinary thing that happens in libraries, and branch libraries, and big libraries every day, which is that there's a line to get in long before the place opens its doors. I think this is an amazing thing. There's tremendous demand in the library for participation, for inclusion. They're accessible, they're democratic. But they also do something else. Libraries are not just places to get books or to find companionship. They're very much that. Libraries are very special today because they're a place where a lot of us learn what it means to become a citizen in a cultural sense, to become a member of a community, right? To have some sense of belonging. This is a photograph by a wonderful photographer named Joey O'Loughlin for a photo series that we did together in Slate magazine several months ago. And this is an image of a girl who's just gotten her first library card. You can see it in her hand. Anybody in this room remember getting their first library card? I can't see very well because of the lights, but raise your hand high if you remember getting a library card. It's a very powerful experience for a lot of people, in part because getting a library card is a remarkable event in your life. It's the first time for many of us that we're actually acknowledged in an official way, by society, by the government, right? We get our first ID card. It says you're an individual person. It's a chance when we get some kind of power to make choices, to pick our own adventure and get the books that we want or the music that we want or the video we want. It's a card that accords us some degree of dignity and respect as well. But there's another thing that it does for us. When we get a library card and we start participating in this part of the public realm, we realize very quickly that we're going to get a book. She's got Curious George, and she's going to have it for a few weeks, and her mother is going to tell her, you're going to have to take care of this book because there are other kids in the library who are going to want to read it after you. So you can't color in the Curious George book, you can't tear out the pages, you can't eat on it, and you got to bring it back in 2 weeks because someone else is waiting for it. And she's going to learn that she's part of a community where there's a role for her to play. And she's also going to learn that she depends on other people doing the same kind of thing, having that same regard for the fate of her, because she's going to want the next Curious George book when she finishes that one. And if her neighbor doesn't return it, then she's got to wait as well. So this incredible civic education that happens in the library every day. Now, I think a lot about the problem of polarization and division that we are really struggling with in the United States, but that you're struggling with in Canada and that societies around the world are grappling with in a major way. Seward Park and the Lower East Side are interesting because they are diverse, but if you really spend time in the neighborhood, you'll see that groups tend to sort themselves pretty quickly. It happens in the playground, it happens residentially. Some are forcibly sorted out, and there's exclusion and discrimination, and some self-select into their in-group. And the library is special not only because it's a physical place that's accessible, but also because it's programmed and staffed by librarians who run programs that help people get to know each other. So for instance, you can do story time where you read books in different languages and attract kids from different communities. You could do the same thing with adults. And we don't have a lot of places in our world right now that do that. New York City, like Toronto, has more people who are living alone and aging alone than ever before. The first book I ever wrote was a book about a heat wave in Chicago where hundreds of people died alone. Many of them very old and living in neighborhoods that didn't have a place for them to go. They were hunkering down at home because the social infrastructure where they lived was so depleted. And this is a scene from one of my favorite moments doing my research for the book. This is a library in Brooklyn in the East New York neighborhood where they participate in the Library Lanes Bowling League. And I've talked to people in Toronto today. You do not have a Library Lanes Bowling League here yet, but I really think you need one. What happens is every Thursday, a bunch of branch libraries in Brooklyn open up their common room. They wheel in an Xbox. They give bowling league jerseys to the members of their team, and the New Lots Bowling League team will bowl against the Stuyvesant bowling team with the Xbox. And they compete every Thursday. And they wear their jerseys, and they have fun together, and they move, and they're active. And the amazing thing is that they wind up having these connections that they otherwise would never have if it weren't for the library, right? These are the same populations that are most at risk of being old and vulnerable and isolated, of dying alone in a heat wave, and they wind up getting to know each other and engaging in a place like a library. But what we're doing in the United States, and we're doing around the world, this is an especially big problem in England right now, is we're closing down libraries. We're reducing their hours. In England, they're literally selling them off for real estate development income because the government's reign of austerity has been so severe. We're shuttering down gathering places at the very moment where we need them most. In fact, maybe some of you saw this a couple years ago, an economist writing in Forbes wrote an article saying that until someone shows the cost-benefit analysis that cashes out the public value of the library, we should knock them all down and replace them with Amazon stores, right? And that's very much part of the zeitgeist. That's very much where we are. And the book that I've written is a book about the value of democratic and accessible social infrastructure, public spaces that have some capacity to bring us together outside of the commercial realm, right, and in a more inclusive way. And the reason I think of places like libraries or parks or playgrounds, or repurposed old industrial facilities that turn into, magical gathering places like this as social infrastructure is because I think it's important for us to couch this language, this argument about cities and placemaking in the language that we're going to be using as we make major decisions about how to rebuild the places we live. We are about to embark on a massive spending spree to bring new infrastructure into our cities. It's going to happen in Canada. It's going to happen in the United States. It's going to happen around the world. Every economist, every development agency, every government that takes itself seriously knows that we will soon be spending trillions of dollars on infrastructure around the world because the systems that we rely on to keep ourselves modern simply don't work. And by the way, it's a lovely city you have here, but I had to wait a very long time to get on the subway today, just like I did when I was in New York. And I also noticed that not every place in Toronto looks like the place we're sitting now, right? And we can think about the places where we're going to need social infrastructure. So I'm going to wrap up with just a couple more images, and I apologize for this one in advance. I want to tell you right now that we have a couple of big ideas about how we're going to build this infrastructure that we all know we're going to need. And on the one hand, we have the biggest infrastructure idea that we're getting from my president at the moment, and his favorite infrastructure idea is the wall, right? He's willing to shut down the government to get the wall. He's going to divert money from all kinds of other things to build a wall because the vision of the future of city making, of place making, of nation building that Trump prizes is organized around the wall, right? And the wall tells us who's in and it tells us who's out. And the wall protects the people on one side, it leaves the other ones vulnerable. The wall makes a statement about who we are and what we want to be. And to be honest, it's not a statement that I feel comfortable with. It's a statement that I reject. I think it's wrong-headed. And if we have an issue with. It comes from this guy, Mark Zuckerberg. I'm guessing some of you are friends with him. After the 2016 election, we have a crisis of social infrastructure. He used that language and he said, don't worry guys, we used to have libraries and civic centers and town halls and union halls. We don't use those things as much anymore, but what we now have is Facebook. And he said, Facebook is going to be the place where you can go for meaningful community engagement. Did you guys get that letter too? Facebook is where you can go for meaningful community engagement. And I have to tell you that really bothered me. I got really upset when I heard that because, first of all, I feel like anytime someone comes up to you and says, there's a major social problem and the solution for that is to buy my product, you should be massively skeptical, right? Huge exception for authors of books, by the way. I just want to be clear about this. It's a completely different issue, and we really need your money and support. It's for a worthy cause, and anyway. So, but the other thing, the real reason that this is such an issue that I was really upset about this is that I have traveled around the world and looked at public places that work well and private places. I've seen social infrastructure in all forms, and I will tell you something. The person who's spent the most money on social infrastructure in the entire world right now is probably Mark Zuckerberg. He's got some competition at Apple and Google because the tech firms that are telling all of us to spend more and more of our time on our devices, the tech firms that are doing everything they can to engineer our attention so we don't put our phones down, when it comes to their own campus, their own workplace, they know that the best thing they can do is create a physical social infrastructure that makes everybody want to stay, right? They're all competing for the same high-end workers, and they don't want them to move from Facebook to Apple or Google, right? They want to keep their employees happy and engaged. And do you think that when Mark Zuckerberg wants his employees to be really engaged at work, he hands them a phone and says, "Try my app"? My kids went to school with the children of the designers when we lived in Silicon Valley, and I'll tell you something. Guess whose children don't get iPhones? Guess whose children aren't on social media? So I'm leaving you with this thought. We have so many big challenges ahead of us in coming years, but we also have some amazing ideas about how to overcome them. And one of the most urgent things we need to figure out is how we create better social infrastructure that allows us to rebuild our societies and restore some sense of the public good that got us buildings like libraries in the first place. And so my plea to you tonight is that we reject this idea of the wall. We reject this idea of the app. And we look for models in the most amazing places we have around us, the physical social infrastructures, places like libraries that make our communities look like this. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you, Eric. A lot to think about. And a call to action, which again, you can't just write about it. You can't just put it out in the world. You have to do something. So thank you. Next, we have another very remarkable human who took a very long flight to be here with us. Tamika Butler, Esquire, is Tool Design's Director of Planning for California and the Director of Equity and Inclusion. Tool Design is the standard for safe street designs and multimodal transportation networks. They have offices in the US, they have offices in Canada. I met Raj, who works with Tool Design, based here in Canada. He's somewhere around here. We should all hang out with him. In addition, Tamika leads Tool Design's external efforts to integrate equity into all project work and internal efforts for Tool to become a diverse, inclusive workspace that empowers people of all backgrounds. A Stanford-trained lawyer, disenchanted by the prospect of a traditional legal career, Tamika has spent her life working in social justice and advocacy. She's been the executive director of both the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust and Los Angeles Country Bicycle Coalition. She truly demonstrates the power of law, community planning, community engagement to empower communities and organizations addressing inequality, diversity, and injustice in their work. She's also not shy in challenging fellow advocates to consider the unintended consequences of the policies they advocate for, to solve getting to the community involved. We are so grateful to have a true trailblazer on stage with us tonight. Welcome, Tamika.
Thank you. How's everybody doing? Let's try again. How's everybody doing? I know it's late. I was on Metro Morning this morning, and it was very early. So I'm going to ask you a couple of favors. Bear with me, because I am tired. Early here is really early in Los Angeles, so it feels like I've been up for a really long time. And the other thing I will say is I do have a few of my coworkers here tonight, which I'm so excited about, including my boss, who has seen a lot of these slides before, because as a company, these are things we're talking about as a company. And so she probably won't laugh at some of my jokes that she's heard before, but just so she thinks I'm great, I would really encourage just some really generous laughter when it gets a little tough, because I know it's late in the evening. So I want to talk to you a little bit about placemaking as anti-oppression work. And before I get into that, I feel like I should tell you a little bit about myself, though that was a great bio. Disenchanted by law, accurate. And so people often, when I go to speak places, are like, who the hell are you? And I get this look a lot. And so I'm just a small town kid from Omaha, Nebraska. Has anybody ever been to Omaha? Why? Like, okay, cool. So most people haven't. And you know, I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, and a little bit all over the world. My dad was in the U.S. Air Force, and so I spent a lot of time growing up in Okinawa, Japan, and then we moved to Nebraska, where there were a lot of my formative years. And it's where I really learned a lot about race and race dynamics. It's where I really saw that, you know, all the black kids really do sit together in the cafeteria. And so as I was trying to figure out who I was and what that meant as this queer woman who liked bow ties and was growing up in Nebraska with a name like Tamika, looking like this, I decided I was going to go to law school and that I was too black and too gay to be Midwestern. And so I went out to Stanford, where I quickly realized that I'm very Midwestern. And I practiced law for a few years, but was disenchanted because I just felt like I wasn't making enough impact. You know, I was a civil rights lawyer that worked on employment issues, and I feel like we would, you know, a young woman who was undocumented would be raped at work, and we would sue her employer, who was also undocumented, and we might win, but then he would have to close the restaurant, which is like good in many ways, but in other ways, the whole staff would lose their jobs. And I just felt really conflicted about what I was doing, and I felt really conflicted about what it meant to be a person who was, you know, I would look around rooms and there wouldn't be other people who looked like me. And so I wanted to find a profession where that wouldn't be the case, and somehow landed in transportation. Wasn't necessarily in the right direction, but that's where I am now. And you know, the lens I bring to my work is really about centering people, and really about, you know, bringing all those lessons as a civil rights lawyer and as a nonprofit leader and as somebody who worked at a foundation and worked in philanthropy, bringing all those things together to do work that is focused on transportation and focused on people. And then this is a picture I always like to show during my presentations, and this is my wife, Kelly, and my son. Kelly hates that this picture is in presentation. She's always like, you couldn't find one where my mouth was shut? But the reason I share this picture, it's a couple of reasons. One, I share this picture because I give a lot of speeches where I make white people really uncomfortable. And because they get uncomfortable, one always comes up to me after and says, why do you hate white people? And I would always say, you know, why do you hate black people? And then they would always say, well, I have black friends. And so now I've just started including a picture of my white wife. And I'm just like, well, I married one, so I really, you know, like, we're cool. And she's Canadian. Her family is French Canadian, so she's super white. So I really, and slightly passive aggressive, really. And so, you know, I think that's one reason I include this picture. The other reason I include this picture is because I talk a lot about equity in my work. And I talk a lot about, you know, community building. And in those conversations, I really use this frame of anti-oppression work. And I think too often we're part of communities, our organizations, our systems, where we expect the people of color to do that work. If somebody has a complaint about accessibility, we expect someone who's living with a disability to tell us what to do. And with Kelly and I, when we decided to have a son, we decided that, you know, we weren't gonna be one of those parents who raised him without a gender. We talked a lot about it, we're good queer progressives, you know, we were like, no trucks. But in reality, he's gonna be viewed as a black man. And so we thought it would be really socially irresponsible to not raise him as a black man. And if he grows up and he decides that that's not who he is, then we will support him, but he might get shot one day just for being a black man. And so we wanted to instill that in him. And when we made that decision, this was something we had to do together. This was something we had to do together when we picked his name, Ate, which is a Lithuanian word, the root of a Lithuanian word that means the future, because my wife's family came to Montreal via Lithuania when they escaped the Holocaust. But for me, it sounds super black, and black people think I made it up. So, like, you know, we were in this together and we're co-parents. And one of the ways we're in this together and we're co-parents is that Kelly doesn't get to say to me, well, since we're raising him as a black man, you have to do it because you're the black mom. She doesn't get to say, I don't know what to do with his hair because you're black, so you do it. She, in fact, has a book called Vanilla Care for Chocolate Hair. I don't really know where this book came from, and it's not helpful. But she has to do that work, right? And so as I go through this and I'm talking about different issues, what I hope people do is realize that if Kelly said that to me, you're the black parent, you have to do this, anyone would understand if I was like, all right, well, deuces, like, this is not the relationship I signed up for. We had a cute kid, but like, I'm not doing this on my own, right? Everyone would understand that. So when we talk about this work of placemaking and being more inclusive in that placemaking, we can't just rely on certain people to do that work. We all have to have a part in it, and if we don't know what that part is, we have to figure it out. We have to figure out what the vanilla care for chocolate hair is in whatever world we're in, and we have to put ourselves out there. The other thing I like to briefly talk about is what is this logo you're seeing in the bottom of these slides? I work at a company called Tool Design, and why I decided to come to Tool Design, a couple of reasons. I had a child and they're expensive. No one told me. He eats a lot, he takes a lot of our resources, but he doesn't really contribute. And then the second reason, and probably the most important reason, is because I found a company that really wasn't afraid to take on some of the hard conversations and do some of the hard things. So before I even started, we looked around and we said, you know, we're better than a lot of other companies when it comes to hiring women and putting them in positions of power. We are proudly a woman-led company, and that changes everything. It means when I have to do something related to my family, it's not even a question. People don't even ask. But we also looked around and said, you know, we're a rather white company, and we can do better. And so we launched this initiative. And again, this was before I even started. And to me, that says the world. It wasn't my job to do. Our leadership said, this is something we have to do. And this is a quote one of my colleagues had. And I think it's important because I think talking about issues like equity are not just important, you know, again, for the future success of our company. You can put anything there for our nation, for our community, for our neighborhood, right? We have to be able to talk about these issues. And for us, one of the ways we did that was we articulated what we were gonna do. This is a long mission statement. It's like, includes everybody. But sometimes when we write things down, it's because we're willing to be held accountable. We're not just saying we're gonna do something. We're gonna look back, we're actually gonna say what we said we were gonna do and see if we do it. So one of the things I sometimes do after my talks is encourage people to write down what they're gonna start doing, what they're gonna stop doing, and what they're gonna do more of, and really write it down. And then put a calendar reminder in 3 months, in 6 months, in a year, and see if you've held yourself accountable, because too often we like to say what we're gonna do, but we don't actually then follow through. And I decided to come to a place where we were gonna follow through. And the last thing I'll say before kind of just launching into the talk is, if you want an example of what I mean about tool design, just go to our website, and just this week, we launched a campaign about the 3 E's. And for many people who know about transportation, you know there have historically been these E's, you know, engineering, evaluation, and we said, let's change the paradigm. Let's talk about not just our values, but also how we want to do the work, what we want to be foundational in all of our work. And when we did that, and when we worked on that as a company, it wasn't just people from the top saying this. We all got together as a team across our 17 offices, and we all talked about what we think guides our work and why we're at this company. And what we walked away with was that ethics are important, equity is important, and empathy is important. And so as I go through this talk, I would just ask you to think about those 3 things, because all of this is really just about doing what's right, doing what's equitable, and having compassion and empathy for yourself and for others as you go through this work. And so I said, this is anti-oppression work. What does oppression even mean? I think a lot of people are like, I know what oppression means, right? I have power and I use it in an unjust or cruel way. Cool. Many people have even heard of institutional oppression, right? There are just certain systems, our practices in place, and we've just kind of considered them a norm. And it's just the normal thing to do, and so we don't even realize it. We don't even realize that it's just normal to maybe put the lift for how people who are living with a disability have to get into a space, right? I have literally been with folks with disabilities and they're like, how do I get into this building? And people are like, you can come in through the back. And that's just normal because that's how we've built spaces. And so it's become this custom, but it's actually institutional oppression. And so those two things are important, but the ones I think are most important are covert oppression and overt oppression. Overt oppression is, again, something that a lot of people know about, right? And when you're the victim of overt oppression, you know it's happening to you. Covert oppression is so much harder. And the reason I like to talk about it is because if we don't point out covert oppression, we won't know how to fix it or stop it. And if a lot of people read this definition and they're like, I don't know what this means, I guarantee every woman in this room has experienced covert oppression, and we all know what this means. Because we've all been at that meeting where we say something, and it's silence, it's crickets. And then a man raises his hand, and he says something, and everybody's like, oh, Dave, that's great. That's a great idea. And you're like, I just said that. But instead of thinking about the institution we're in, where Dave can say certain things, and he's viewed as a go-getter, and somebody who's visionary. But if you say those things in the same way Dave says them, you're viewed as aggressive or pushy, right? Instead of thinking about that, we internalize it, and we instead say, oh, well, maybe Dave articulated himself better. You know what? He spoke with more clarity and more confidence. We start to question ourselves instead of realizing that this is all part of institutional and oppression that has become covert. And we need folks to see this because we need somebody else to then raise their hand and is like, actually, I think Dave said the same thing as Sally. And I actually like the way Sally phrased it because we need that support. That's one of those examples of how we all have a role to play. And as we start doing this work more and thinking about, taking spaces to places, something that has become a buzzword are diversity. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. But too often, we don't know what these words mean. And so I like to simplify them, maybe oversimplify them. But I like folks to realize they're not interchangeable because too often people think diversity, equity, and inclusion are interchangeable. And that's not true. Diversity is like, think of 90s clip art, right? It's just like, get as many diverse people in this picture as possible. The woman in the wheelchair, wheel her to the front. Make the white man stand in the back and pretend he can't see anything. Women, lots of women. Is that person a religious minority? Throw them in there, right? That's diversity. It's literally just getting as many diverse people as possible at the table. That is different than inclusion. You can have a diverse organization that is not inclusive. Because if you are not part of setting the culture, if you are not part of setting, the decisions, if you don't have the ability to control what we do and what we don't do, then you're just an exotic face at the table that allows people to hit that checkbox, but not really give up any of their power. And if what we're ultimately trying to get to is equity, we can't get there without inclusion. And people like to say, diversity and inclusion, but the reality is they're not the same, and they don't always come together. And too often, those of us who are diverse know we're being tokenized because you just want us there. You don't actually want us to say anything. So every time you see a fashion designer who puts out a hoodie with the noose around the neck, and everybody's like, how did that happen? Were there no people of color who worked there? The answer is yes, people of color definitely worked there. They were all around the table being like, yo, did you see that hoodie? That's not gonna go well on Twitter. But they are not the decision makers. They do not have the power to say that can't happen. And that's what true inclusion means. And then we can start talking about equity. And I actually like to say inequity because that's actually what we're talking about, the inequities that have been built into our spaces. And in its simplest form, Equity means giving people who have historically had the least the most. And that's really hard, right? Because what no one likes to talk about in placemaking and urban planning and city building, like the dirty little secret is that this work is political. And when work is political, it's really hard to get an elected official to say, you're right. We've had it really good over here for a long time, so I'm just gonna go out and tell my constituents we're good and to give it to those people over there. No one's gonna do that. It's really hard to get someone to do that. But it doesn't mean that's not what we should be going towards. And frankly, equity is where we are at now. That's what people are comfortable with. But what we should really be fighting for is liberation. What we should really be fighting for is freedom. But we don't have that slide because I don't know if you guys are ready yet for that one. But we do have power, and I've mentioned power a few times. As I said, I'm from Nebraska, I'm from the Midwest in the United States. Kanye West, one of our greatest figures in the Midwest, until he wasn't. But he has the song, right? No one man should have all that power, right? And power is the ability to get what you want. And everyone does not have power to get what they want. But that doesn't mean there's not a difference between power with people and power over people, right? Because the reality is sometimes we think only certain people have power, but the communities we're working in, they already have power. They're already the experts. And so if we can stop thinking in a colonial mindset of let's have power over people and empower them, and instead think let's have power with people and co-power them, and let's realize them as the experts they already are. There was this project in LA where people kept dying getting across the street. And so the experts with the power came in and said, we're gonna switch the layout of this street. And so they made all these changes, they made all these investments, they changed the signal timing, they changed the width, they put in some crosswalks, and then people kept dying, and they couldn't figure out why. They talked to people in the community finally, and what people said in this low-income community of color is, this is the only tree we have on this street, and it's on this side of the street, and the bus stop's on this side of the street. And so you can put crosswalks in at the intersection, but our elders are not gonna walk to the intersection to catch the bus. They're gonna sit in the shade, and then when they see the bus coming, they're gonna try to get across the street. And that's why people keep dying. And if those experts from the city had had a framework of having power with people instead of power over people and trying to empower people to cross the street safely, if they instead said, we're gonna co-power people to co-design with us how we're gonna get across the street safely, they could have saved a lot of money. And then one of the last things I want to talk about are microaggressions. And the reason I like to talk about microaggressions is because when we talk about placemaking, microaggressions are huge. Microaggressions are when we say that spaces are for everyone, but when certain of us walk into the space, we see people look at us twice and wonder if we belong there. Imagine if you were white and you went to a hip hop show in the barbecue after, and you walked in and you were like, oh, am I supposed to be here? Because that's how I feel every day. And you can choose not to feel that way, but I don't get to choose that way. I have gone into women's bathrooms and been physically pushed out. I have been at the gym in the locker room and have people look at me and pick up all their stuff and wrap up with a towel and walk away. They don't say anything to me. And so we call that a microaggression, but the reality is part of why making spaces, places is so hard for some of us is because we're constantly experiencing these microaggressions, which frankly, we shouldn't be calling microaggressions because they're just plain aggressive. And if anything I've talked about at this point, you haven't thought about that much, it's because you have privilege. And that's not something to feel guilty about, that's just something to acknowledge and own. But the reality is people do feel guilty, and then they get sad. As sad as Canadian hockey players when American hockey players beat them. It's just really sad. You feel like it shouldn't happen to you, and you feel like it shouldn't happen to you because it rarely happens to you. But when it does happen to you, you're like, oh my God. And instead of saying like, no, we're actually better, the Americans aren't gonna beat us that much, and seeing what you can learn from that, it's so sad. And that's because of white fragility. Because often, instead of being able to center the experience of folks who constantly feel othered, the one time we feel othered, we can't handle it, right? And fragility is something we have to be able to get away from. And not just white people can be fragile, everybody can be fragile. When I came out to my mom as gay, she didn't speak to me for a year. And she was worried that people were gonna think she was a bad parent. That was about her, not about me. She was being fragile. And we have to learn how to get past that so that we can actually do the work. So some people now are like, I think Tamika's gone longer than 20 minutes, and I'm already uncomfortable. What are we talking about? Almost like when I try to take cheese from my son. But what I'm talking about isn't just going out there and doing placemaking and doing the external work in the community. I'm talking about things that you should think about for yourself as a person. Because you can't go out and build a place and placemake if you haven't even done the internal work. And that's hard. That's like Drake staying faithful to Rihanna hard. Like, it takes work, right? They have this song, work, 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 and they just say it over and over again, and it's really annoying. And that's how this equity work feels. Rihanna might be like, I hate this song, I can't believe I ever wrote it, and all he cares about is the Raptors, why am I even here? But you have to keep doing the work. You can't get bored just because it's hard. And that's especially true in this province. I read this report, doing research for this, about how over 2/3 of folks here feel a sense of belonging to their local community. And I was like, well, shit, things are great. Good thing my wife's a dual citizen, let's go. But then I did more research, and I was like, oh, but I'd still be black. And it's really hard to be black here. My kid would be more likely to be in foster care or enrolled in a lower academic stream. And that happened to me in the States. I got really good grades, but my school said, oh, we don't have honors classes because they didn't believe I could do it. You see black men more likely to interact with the criminal justice system. Black women who are educated still being less likely to get a job than white women who have less education. So we have to ask ourselves, every time we go into spaces and we're placemaking, where are all the black people? Where are all the people with disabilities? Where are the trans folks? How is the person with the disability gonna get here? Where's the trans folks gonna go to the bathroom? And we can't depend on me to walk in and look at the crowd and be like, hey, black person, what's up, right? You can't wait for me to do that. We all have to do that. And I think sometimes there's this narrative in Canada that it's better here. I remember talking to my father-in-law, and he was like, yo, when I grew up, all we learned is that there was slavery in the States, it was really bad, and so black people took the Underground Railroad and they came to Canada because we're better. And I think there's that narrative, but the reality is things are tough here. I don't usually like having text-heavy slides, but I just felt like these examples really stuck out. And for me, that last one about somebody in London being told to get out of the store and having the police called on him, because I've been to that grocery store, because my wife has family in London. The family in London happens to be black. So I've been at that grocery store with my black niece and nephew, and to think that they might live in a place that in my mind is better than where I live, but they're experiencing the same things. And so again, right now, someone's like, no, really, you've been talking longer than 20 minutes, and I still don't know how this is about spaces to places. Let's talk about placemaking. And placemaking is important here. And this is from that same report that basically found that even though people feel connected to their communities, more can be done here in Ontario. That there still needs to be trust built by putting together more of these pieces of social infrastructure, as Eric would say, bringing together diverse groups, even the folks who are marginalized and disadvantaged. And that when you create these safe and attractive public spaces, that's when people can really play freely, meet each other, interact. and that this has to be part of the policy here. So it seems like you all do get that this social infrastructure is really important. And so where is the gap? Why are we still struggling with what placemaking means? And I think part of the reason is because we still have this framework of if we build it, they will come. And the reality is that some of us don't feel comfortable coming, or when we get there, we are shown so many signs that we don't belong. And it starts with this framework of placemaking. We go in as these experts and we say, we're gonna, make places. We're gonna create social infrastructure. When in reality, many of the places we're going to are already places. They're just not places for us. The one thing that is true is that we're all settlers if you're not indigenous, right? All of these places were places before we ever got here. And so if we can't go in with that humility, that in placemaking we first have to acknowledge the history of places, then whatever we create isn't gonna be that authentic space we're hoping for. And that's thinking about those different issues. That's living life at the intersections. I always say you can't, as a planner or as an engineer, have somebody come to you and say, this intersection is a mess, fix it. And say, that seems really hard. Can I just make a parklet mid-block and call it good? Because you wouldn't be doing your job. But for some reason, when we have to think about placemaking and affordable housing and sexism and colonialism, that feels scary. And so we don't do it. But the reality is there are some of us who live at the intersections every single day. We have to be there. When I walk into a room and someone grabs their purse, I don't know if it's because they see that I'm black. I don't know if it's because they think I'm a black man. I don't know if it's because they think I'm a brash and a loud American. I don't know. But I'm constantly thinking about all of those things because I live at the intersections. And for those of us who, again, don't think about these things and have the privilege not to live at the intersections, how do we force ourselves to do it? And I will just end by giving some concrete suggestions. You have to understand the difference between cultural sensitivity and cultural appropriation. Sometimes we go in with the best intentions. And one of the problems in placemaking when we think about social infrastructure is that our intentions are here, but what we're actually doing is over here. And that gap is the hardest gap to bridge. Because when people have good intentions, they do not like the feedback that they're not actually doing what they intended to do. Because they're like, but I'm a good person. And they like the part where they get to pat themselves on the back and say, I'm being culturally sensitive. They don't like the part where they have to acknowledge that they might actually be doing cultural appropriation. And they might actually be tokenizing people. So you have to have an awareness and acceptance, and you have to adapt to the different environments you're in. Because as a black person, I've had to adapt, right? And so how do we get everybody to adapt? And part of that is being culturally competent. You start learning how to integrate the different things you're seeing in these different environments and then transform that knowledge about individuals that you might have had and start changing the way you operate while still being your authentic self. Some of us call this code switching because we have to do it all the time. And I'll just end in this place. As you do this work, it's hard, right? And we're all on a journey. And the last things I'll say is this journey has many stops. For many of us, we start as an actor. And Mel Gibson is a great example of this because he's a great actor. Look at him, he wins awards. But he's a horrible person. He does horrible things. And sometimes you have to be an actor. You have to fake it until you make it. When you're going out and creating that social infrastructure and people say, gender-neutral bathrooms are important, you don't understand why, but you just do it. But the problem with staying at this place of being an actor is that at some point, if you really don't say, I'm doing this for the right reasons and internalize it, it will come up that you're actually a bad person, right? You have to actually commit to going beyond just faking it until you make it and actually trying to be an ally. And that means actually doing something. It's not just changing a Facebook status because, as we heard, Facebook is not the social infrastructure we need. It's about actually what are you going to do to be an ally? And this might mean that when that woman says something and it falls on deaf ears, you shoot her that email after the meeting and you say, I just want you to know, I realize what happened, I appreciate you, and I see you, right? You're doing something. And beyond that, push yourself to say that's not enough. You actually want to be an accomplice. And we were talking earlier about what's the risk that you need to take. And that's what being an accomplice is about. Why did you send an email? Why didn't you just say what you said in the email in the meeting? And oftentimes it's because you're like, well, I don't want people to think the things about me that they think about that person. I don't want them to think I'm aggressive and brash. You don't want to risk something. You got your seat at the table and you don't want to give it up. And so you have to ask yourself, to be an accomplice, what are you willing to risk? What are you willing to give up? Because if we're truly trying to create places from spaces, it's going to take all of us working together. And I'll just end by saying, I'll skip these, that when you do this work, you have to swim upstream. You can't just say, we're going to build something, and then when people don't come, say, why don't they come? You have to look at the root causes. And you have to, again, do that as your authentic self. Don't try to be someone you're not. Know who it is you're trying to serve. Clearly articulate what it is you're trying to do, and then co-power with those folks. Don't just try to empower them. And this piece around empathy, you will make mistakes. Some of us are so afraid to make mistakes that we don't try the hard thing. But there are others of us who have no choice but to be fearless and try to do things even if we're going to make mistakes. So if we can all force ourselves to make mistakes, have that empathy with ourselves and others, and continue to think about our privilege and to make other people's problems our problems, then we can start realizing that this isn't just about transportation, our education, our affordable housing. When we have these public spaces and we think this is a library and this is for reading, the people showing up there aren't just coming with their library book and their library card. They're coming with multiple issues. There is no such thing as a single issue struggle. So we can't be the transportation planner that shows up and says, I can't answer that question, I do transportation. We have to be the person who says, I see the intersections, and what am I going to do about it? Thank you.
Thank you, Tamika and Eric. Is my mic working? Someone give me, great, awesome. For those of you, I saw some people scribbling away. Reminder to put your question up. We're getting close to time, so we can't go through all of the questions, but we can certainly organize them and get them to the speakers and share them out. But we're going to start with a few. So thank you again for both of your remarks. There was a lot of talk about process, trying things, getting ideas that aren't that great, doing things that might feel right in the moment but don't really turn out to do the good in the world that they seek to do. This feels like it's, okay, I'm going to switch to this mic.
So my question for our two speakers is, what was one mistake you either observed or you personally did in placemaking? So you were on a project, you were working with a community, like just a big mistake that has stuck with you and taught you how to do something differently.
So, I didn't talk much about the Rebuild by Design competition dynamics, but one of the really crucial features of this competition is different from traditional architecture competitions in that the design teams weren't asked to come with a project and a proposal that was specific and already articulated. Instead, they had to submit a mission statement and then go through a 9-month process that involved 3 months of research, collaborative research, 3 months of stakeholder meetings with people in the communities where they wanted to build something, and then 3 months of participatory design where they had an iterative process of working with the various stakeholders on design ideas. And only after that 9-month process could they submit a design for the jury. And that's a really different process than we typically have when we think about city making. Typically, placemaking happens from the top down, and you might have a design group that does a couple of consultations and then does what they want to do because they pulled the quotes that they need from those community meetings. But this was really an attempt to do something like that, to make it more participatory, and we're using this process a lot. But there's a flaw in the competition model, which I think is really difficult. And that is that there were 10 teams that pitched ideas and that did this participatory process with 10 different communities in the region, all of which had real needs. And we saw this coming, but I think it was hard for the government agencies that were running this process to see where it was going to go until the end. But when you have a competition, inevitably what that means is that a couple of groups win and a lot of groups lose. And it's one thing when you have a design competition and some architecture firms don't get the commission, or a construction agency doesn't get the commission. But it's another thing to go to 10 different neighborhoods with real vulnerability and to talk to people about those vulnerabilities and to bring to them the possibility that there's going to be federal resources to help you out, only to have them learn that their neighbors on the other side of the city got the resources and they didn't. And I think one of the real problems with Rebuild by Design, as with other competitions that are increasingly using this participatory model, is they can generate a lot of bad feelings on the other side and make a community that's already feeling vulnerable feel abandoned. And I think that's a very tough one.
Yeah, I think a quick one for me is, I think very early on in my career, I never wanted to let people down. I especially didn't want low-income people of color. I didn't want to let them down because, my dad has 14 brothers and sisters. He grew up in the projects. He, sold drugs. So when I was in the hood, I didn't want to let people down. And so I would just say yes to everything. And I think that's often a mistake we make. Because we want to do the right thing, we say yes. And I think we don't have enough trust in the community to realize that even though people will be upset if we tell them the truth, they will be less upset than if we tell them yes and then come back and say no. And so I think sometimes a mistake we make when we're trying to really do like collaborative community building is that we say yes to everything instead of being honest, direct, and transparent and using those hard conversations to build trust and come together so that even if people don't like us or even if people don't like the answer they ultimately get, they at least trust that we listened and that we tried and that we're being honest.
Great. Got a couple great questions from all of you, so thank you for submitting them. So Eric, you talk a lot about libraries. Libraries as spaces that we have to reimagine. What are the other places that have as much potential that are inspiring that we should be looking to and thinking about?
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, this book is not a book about libraries, but I find myself talking about libraries a lot because I think they're an extraordinary achievement. And they really represent some of the best features of social infrastructure for me, in part because there's a physical aspect to them. I mean, they're buildings, they're structures, they're designed to have a number of different activities, but they're also programmed and staffed. And I think it's important for us to note that social infrastructure, works better when it has some people who are guiding us through the experience, and to work through some of these difficult situations that, as you mentioned, inevitably are going to come up when you have a public and accessible facility. So in the book I talk about other places as well. I think playgrounds are remarkable places. Again, having grown up in Chicago in the 1970s and 80s, I saw a lot of playgrounds in my neighborhood that were once really wonderful and that fell apart and that had broken glass and equipment that wasn't working. And what happened is the playground turned from being a place where people could come together and build relationships. Like, just think for a second about how many relationships have developed because two caretakers are pushing the same swing on the same set of afternoons. Your son's only 1 year old, so you're gonna get more of this. But I mean, there's a world of things happen because you see someone often enough that at some point when your phone rings, you feel comfortable saying, hey, Tamika, would you mind pushing my son too? And then over time, we wind up having a play date, and that turns into something more. And so if you have something like a playground in your neighborhood, it really changes local social life and the capacity you have for community building. Whereas if you don't have one, you're just more likely, not to engage. So I write about them. I spend a lot of time playing sports. I spend a lot of time myself playing sports, and my children are very active. And I think about the relationships I have in my life because my son plays on a regional soccer team where there are kids from all different communities. You know, I have a group of fathers who live on Long Island, you know, who probably vote for Voldemort. And then I have another, you know, group of people who, you know, are you know, just here from Latin America. And somehow, you know, it's not like we talk about politics and work out all our differences, but there's this funny little world of people who spend every Saturday and many Sundays together, traveling around, because we share a love for our children and a love for this game, and the field itself and the organization around it winds up being a resource for us. And it's not as if that's, again, solves the problem of polarization or division, but we do veer into topics of conversation that help us understand each other and make sense of the situation, be a little less hostile and a little more human. And I don't know that that's the highest goal in the world, but if you look at what's happening in the United States right now, or in Germany right now, or in Turkey right now, or in Brazil right now, and I can't say what's happening in Toronto, but I think our bar has gotten fairly low. It feels to me like we have this very urgent challenge to begin to rebuild the foundational building blocks of civil society. And if we can't establish some sense of shared recognition of our common humanity and decency, I don't see how we build up a project that gets us to solutions to things like, you know, racial inequality and climate change and concentrated poverty. I think we have an urgent project to begin at the beginning.
What do you think?
So I agree with a lot of the same examples, but it might be because I just read Eric's book, which you should all read.
It's a great read.
So I used to work at an organization that built parks and gardens, and so I think parks and community gardens, I think there are those spaces that bring folks together. Everyone always says one of the most segregated times of the week is, you know, during church on Sunday, because that's when people are with people who are just like them. And so I think places that get you out of that space, where you can start recognizing people and seeing the same people, and we can't be afraid to intentionally create those spaces. And I would also say we also have to be clear that sometimes it's important to have spaces just for certain people, and those spaces have to be respected too.
Well, I'm encouraged to hear so much talk about playgrounds. At Evergreen, one of our most national programs has been to transform learning grounds, working with schools and school boards across the country. And I have to say that most of our adult programming is actually inspired by what we learn on the playground, how you deal with risk, how you create safe and, I hope, brave spaces for people to be in. So I'm encouraged to hear that those are spaces.
And I'll say one other thing about this. I don't know if you're experimenting with this, but in many countries in the world, there are real efforts to try to create park spaces, play spaces that are multi-generational, right? So the playground should not only be an amenity for our youngest people. You know, we have an aging society. We have societies where more and more people are living alone. We need to find public resources that draw people into shared activities. And there's a whole world of designers that are thinking about multi-generational play spaces where young people and older people can be together, or older people can exercise and take, manage risks together. And the model of thinking about aging as a thing that gets you into a geriatric ghetto, where you should knit, has to be exploded, because older people are physically younger than ever before. I mean, what it means to be 65 or 75 or 80 is really different than what that meant 20 years ago. So we have an active population that we need to keep engaged for our own sake.
Definitely, and very inspired to check out. So we have Amanda from 880 Cities here in the audience, and their whole view on the world is if you design cities for people who are 8 and 80, that they're inclusive and offer an opportunity for us to have cities that are really strong and resilient. So one thing that I think both of you, being in academia, being in the private sector, but lots of nonprofit experience, is that great. So we understand social infrastructure. We have a lot of work to do, both personal and physically in the world. But there's a lot of people out there, especially in the era of Voldemort, etc., where we have to make a case for why we make these investments and why we do this work. So from your perspectives, what's your pitch? Why should, I'm that father on your kid's basketball team who really just wants to watch hockey and not talk about anything else. Why should I care?
So, my book starts with the story of, my first book, which is this book about a heat wave. And the kind of big finding that was really surprising that got me interested in the social infrastructure concept from the beginning is that if you looked really closely at which neighborhoods fared well and which neighborhoods were vulnerable during this catastrophe, something really powerful and surprising emerged. There are a lot of neighborhoods in Chicago that are very poor, that are very segregated, that are isolated and vulnerable. But interestingly enough, a bunch of the neighborhoods that demographically looked like they should have done really badly in the heat wave did do badly. They had horrible death rates. But a bunch of neighborhoods that looked demographically like they should have done really badly proved to be the most resilient places in the city. They did better. There are a bunch of African American neighborhoods that are poor, depleted, vulnerable on so many registers that were far more resilient in this event than the most affluent white neighborhoods on the north side of Chicago. That's a really interesting question. And when I looked closely at what the driver was, it turned out that the neighborhoods that had a depleted social infrastructure fostered isolation. And that isolation made people at incredible risk in the heat wave, but also every day. And if you looked at the places that were poor and did well, they had like this surprisingly robust set of sidewalks and commercial institutions and neighborhood organizations and parks and playgrounds and libraries. They had a social infrastructure that kept people connected. And the truth is that what was really important is it wasn't just the case that this mattered in the heat wave. It also turns out that the neighborhoods that had strong social infrastructure had life expectancies that were many years longer than the neighborhoods that had weak social infrastructure. And that was even true in neighborhoods that were separated by one street. And for me, I don't think there's a better metric I can give at the moment for why social infrastructure matters and how it can affect life and death all the time, and also in the kinds of situations that we have to fear as the climate changes. There are a lot of people now who say, we need to do more and more research to have better measures. I want to be able to show to my city government or to the federal government, if we invest this much money in the playground, we're going to get this return on quality of life. If I invest this much money in the library, I'm going to get that return on quality of life and education. And I get that. I understand why you want to have the best numbers, and in some of these cases, we're going to be able to find metrics for these things. But also, I've lived through the United States long enough to know that if we're locked into the idea that the only way to move the policy debate and get ambitious policy proposals passed is if we have an accurate metric, the right data for showing you. If you think that's how policy works, I invite you to come and observe my country sometime. So it's good to have that stuff, but frankly, I think we also need to be telling better stories, right? And we need to be able to learn from these experiences and make the case. And so part of the problem of our time is I think we haven't been bold enough. I think we haven't been ambitious enough. And we have let go of too much ground. And it's time for us to step back into the game and make our voices heard.
Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think sometimes we hold too much on to quantitative data. Quantitative data is important, but it's not the only answer, and it can't be the only way that we solve our policy problems. And I think a saying in the Black community is, you can't tear down the master's house with the master's tools, which is essentially this idea of like, let's not conform to what folks are telling us to use as the tools. Let's think of new tools. And so I think that's part of the idea. You have to be able to think outside the box of just this data piece, while acknowledging that also but he's still the master, so let's also learn what these tools are. So I think it's the balance, right? I think it's both understanding quantitative data, but realizing that for so long, the people who are able to create quantitative data, when we think of professors, many of us think of white people. When we think of folks who put together data, who are able to, get their books and their published studies about certain communities, there is, again, that institutional oppression piece that mean that some people have more access to that, and they can't be the only ones who are experts on something. And so we have to embrace that expertise is really helpful, but it's not the only expertise, and how do we bring them together? And I think for the people who make that argument of that's not my problem, which is kind of what you're saying, we have this conversation all the time in the transportation world, when transportation agencies are I'm not an affordable housing agency, that's not my problem that people, can't afford to live in the city centers. And our response to that is, yeah, but as people get pushed further out and you need them in the economic centers, guess who's gonna have to run transit out there? You, transit agency. And so I think that's that idea about seeing how things are tied together in intersections. things we think aren't our problems often are going to become our problem.
But,
Yeah,
I
so-
should say, I know we're running short on time, but just on that note, to hit where I think you're really directing us here, I'm for quantitative and qualitative evidence. We use the best evidence we have, but I think that, what you're pointing to is we only have knowledge and we only have measures of any kind if we know to ask questions about the thing. And I think one of the failures of scientific institutions and policymaking institutions is because they have not been inclusive. They failed to appreciate the significance of knowledge that really matters. Right. And the story you told about the traffic deaths on the street in Los Angeles is perfect. Like engineers and policymakers who think about transportation have a certain set of questions that they always ask. And it's often based on knowledge that comes from on high. And we live in a time where we're going to have all kinds of new metrics that come from the machines that we carry, from knowledge that comes from 30,000 feet. And I guess the pitch I'm making here is there's a grounded knowledge that comes from really understanding dynamics of everyday life. And the only way to get that knowledge is to make sure you have an inclusive set of processes that brings everyone to the table to produce knowledge. And if we don't produce knowledge about issues that we care so much about, we're going to wind up coming up with the wrong ideas and the wrong policies.
So there's a lot there. There's telling better stories, showing people how it is their problem, so understanding your audience, their interests, and mashing together qualitative, quantitative. There's a lot you both gave us to think about. I have my final question of the night. It's lightning round. You have 30 seconds to answer, and it's, what is something that you learned or were inspired by the other's presentation?
Well,
30 seconds.
Well, look, I actually think there's something really powerful in what Tamika said about doing the work that you need to do, that each of us needs to do before we go into placemaking. So before you arrogate to yourself the power, the authority to go and tell someplace how it could be better, to build something, you better be really clear that you understand the biases you bring into the situation, what you know well, and you should do your best to ask what you don't know, right? And that means really checking in with people who have a different kind of knowledge than you have, and it certainly means if you're doing placemaking in some particular community, that you're listening really seriously to local knowledge. And too often planners fail on that score.
So I'll say, before you start the clock on my 30 seconds,
First,
I just want to thank you all for coming. I think it's huge that you're giving, a night during the week to come out here and listen to us, and that's really important to me. So thank you for your generosity and your time. Thank you to Evergreen. I think this is a cool space. I think you all are doing a lot right, and I think it's really cool that you're bringing these conversations together. Because I have Canadian in-laws, I know that sometimes silence doesn't mean anything. I remember the first time I met them, and I was like, oh my God, they hated me. They didn't say anything. They didn't laugh at anything. And then we walked out of their house, and my wife was like, they love you. So hopefully you all loved us. And I will say that, what really inspired me about Eric is, I read his book in preparation of this, listening to him speak and just being in space with him. It's his ability to not settle with what is, but to think about what could be, and to push us all to think about what could be. And in thinking about what could be, he's thinking about creative ideas that don't exist yet, but he's not abandoning things we already know work. And so I think that's a really unique skill, to not just say, it's all about the future, it's all about technology, but it's really like, we can do this. And just because something is this way doesn't mean that it has to stay this way. And I would say that that's something that I think so many folks who are marginalized have. We always say you have to be creative, and some of the most creative people are folks who have been marginalized, because they have to leave their country and imagine that there could be a better life. They have to imagine that they're going to be treated the same when they haven't all along. And so I think if you can take Eric's spirit, if you can take their spirit, that just because something is doesn't mean it has to be, hopefully that can inspire you to ask yourself, what am I going to do?
Thank you. So I want to do a couple quick thank yous before we end the night. Thank you to TD for your support in making this all possible. Thank you so much to our volunteers. I know you got here a couple of hours early. This has been a long haul for you, and we really appreciate you taking the time to make this run really smoothly. Thank you to our audience, for joining us tonight. Another plug, if this is something that you are leaving thinking, wow, I would love to do that more often, please check out our Future Cities Canada Summit in 2 months. We'd love to see you there. And thank you to our speakers. If you just want to give them one more round of applause, they were amazing. So this concludes our speaker series, but there are still some things to do if you'd like to continue to hang out. The bar is open. Eric will be in the back signing books. You're welcome to stay and check out the building. We just launched a new exhibit you can go down this innovation corridor and check out. And finally, we want to hear from you on how to enhance the spaces in this building. So we have an interactive sticky board over there for you to tell us what you love, hate, and would love to see. So thank you, everybody, and let's call it a night.